Today in the studio, we have with us a very special person, Bill Redutzl, economics professor at Harvard, chief financial officer of Sun Microsystems, and chief information officer of AOL Warner. He's been a strategic advisor for more than a decade to Naspers. We have Bill in the studio today with us to talk to us about trends in technology. He's got a vast knowledge and insight in how historically some of these trends developed. If we understand these trends, we might have some signposts in intuiting what might happen in the future. Bill, it's all over to you. Let me start off with asking you, do you think would be the single most important trend that developed over the years in technology? So-called law number one, if you want to understand what is happening in technology and how it's developing.
20 years ago, Gordon Moore, who was one of the founders of Intel, published in a trade magazine a simple sidebar. It wasn't even the main part of the article, in which he observed that semiconductor density had doubled every 18 months since the beginning of semiconductors. And that came to be known as Moore's Law. And Moore's Law still has another 20 years, maybe 30 years to run. And what it says is that computers, basically the core silicon that makes them up, is getting cheaper at a rate of 30% a year. Never in the history of technology or the world has anything gotten cheaper at 30% a year for 30 years. And that's 97% a decade. And that's still the basic driver. I mean, everything is being driven by Moore's Law. I was on a study panel in the United States, and we looked at all the evidence, and that has been the driver. I mean, it is still going to be the driver, and it's going to fuel the next round of innovation will still be Moore's Law, because things which today cost 100 Rand will cost 3 Rand in 10 years. So when you have that kind of change, you're going to change everything that goes around it.
So, Bill, you say another 20 to 30 years to run for Moore's Law.
Right.
So the one thing that we can assume that if we have got anything to do that is touched by silicon, it's going to get cheaper at 30% per year.
Right. I mean, the big round, the next generation, if the last round of innovation was driven by these things, which are personal devices, the next thing is going to be what people call the Internet of Things, but it's basically computers become so cheap they're throwaway. A company in the US just announced a computer that is the size, smaller than a grain of sand. I mean, it's smaller than a grain of rice. And it's designed to be swallowed and thrown away. And it's a complete computer. It has communications, it has a processor, it has memory, and it's designed to be thrown. So sensors are going to be a thing. And we're seeing this now in wearable devices, tracking how you sleep, how you walk, tracking your health as you go, tracking the health of a building, tracking, I mean, people talk about something called smart dust, which are these tiny computers thrown on the ground. When you step on them, they alert people that somebody just stepped on a grain of sand in the forest. So you have a way, I mean, it changes everything. And I think it's hard to predict. I mean, in last year, I got online and I went to the Financial Times and I asked how many times the word smartphone appeared in 2003, 10 years ago. The answer was 0. In 2003, there wasn't one article in the Financial Times about smartphones. And yet today, you probably can't go more than a page in the Financial Times without finding references to smartphones and how they're changing the world and how they're changing the way people interact, how people think, how people conduct business, how people conduct their social lives, people conduct everything. I mean, it's all being done. I mean, there are now more mobile phones on Earth than there are people. Not everybody has one because so many people have 2. But I mean, we're going to have smartphones in the hands of 5 or 6 or 7 billion people in another 3 years. I mean, they cost nothing, and they're going to be down to very low costs. Yet 10 years ago, nobody was talking about it. I mean, they actually were what we would call a smartphone on the market, but nobody saw them as other than a niche product for a handful of technical people that they were going to go use. So, I mean, laws of physics have driven everything. I mean, it's very important to understand that fundamentally all these revolutions happen as laws of physics change. The iPhone was two changes that were very, very important. One was the realization that at the smartphone you could build in that time, voice could just be an application. And the reason that mattered is it meant you could use traditional technology from the software industry to run on a smartphone. So suddenly there were millions of developers, not a few thousand. And that's what allowed the whole app ecosystem to build and everything. And the second thing was the material science that figured out how to make a multi-touch screen so that you could do everything that we do today on a smartphone and take that for granted. Those are two advances in the laws of physics. So what's the next thing like that that's going to be on the horizon? And people think that it's, again, the same twofold. One is that these things are going to get very, very cheap and very, very small. And the second is we're going to interact with them in more natural ways. People thinking voice, gestures, as opposed to having to actually look at a screen. And clearly there's a lot going on right now in trying to do that, especially to try to put this stuff into cars.
Well, that's fascinating, and also your remark that the one thing that changed the iPhone was that they saw voice as an application so that you could run on basic software,
Right.
whereas the demise of Nokia was that they remained anchored in a phone to which they wanted to ask to add features.
Right.
That's
I mean,
a basic problem in perspective, a basic failure in the right perspective. Is that right?
For both BlackBerry and Nokia,
Yeah.
they had phone operating systems and they opened them up to let you add applications. But you had to become a specialist in the way they did it. And they, in some ways, crippled those applications to make sure that the phone was always preeminent. And with Apple, they didn't do that. And then Andy Rubin saw that and said, this is a good idea, and went off and built Android. And after that, the rest is history. But it's all the fundamental change in Moore's Law that you needed to have a very cheap 700 megahertz processor. And once you hit that point, everything else became feasible. I mean, new smartphones next year will have 8 processing cores and will run probably at 2 gigahertz. I mean, you're going to have more power than any computer on Earth a decade ago in your hand for, hundreds of dollars, probably. I mean, as these things come out, maybe a lot less.
Bill, obviously I want to ask you about what's the second and the third and the fourth law that you would rank after that. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask you a question. What new kind of invention in infrastructure do you think could we expect that would change the whole ball game? When I look at the development of the smartphones that you've now mentioned, the invention of the internet and GPS are two fundamental technologies that make.
Correct.
The third one would be the World Wide Web, which is basically an interface to the internet. All three of them were developed and invented not by entrepreneurs, but by people drawing a salary from some kind of a state organization, DARPA
Right.
and CERN. What's your response to that?
Well, I am a member of a group that has publicly been on record bemoaning the lack of continued investment in this type of basic research and the implications of that for the future, because we aren't funding that. Anywhere in the world, that stuff is not happening the same way. People sitting down and going off and experimenting, there's some lore to it. I mean, that the original idea of the internet was to have a network which could survive a nuclear attack, and that was one of the design goals that they had. But all this technology, it's old. I mean, the internet's 50 years old. And the idea for GPS, that's 30 years old. I mean, we never saw it. I would add to that pictures, the idea you can do digital cameras, which comes from Kodak in 1975. Steve Jobs did not want a camera on the iPhone. He had a fight with his product managers, and he finally let them put a really cheap camera on the first iPhone because he didn't think that a camera belonged on the phone. And today, cameras are going. I mean, you can get 45 megapixel image taking on your smartphone. I mean, the idea that you need a separate device, 90% of all images on the internet, 95% probably, now are taken on phones. So, people didn't see that. So the lack of fundamental research is it's a challenge. It's a problem. I don't know where the next one is going to come.
So what we're actually experiencing is almost the second level of innovation, all built onto those three fundamental infrastructural,
Right.
groundbreaking innovations.
Well, the computer as we know it dates from Turing and von Neumann in the 30s at the Institute for Advanced Research at Princeton.
Exactly.
And they laid out all the basic principles which apply to this day. I mean, and if you say something is a computer, there's a Turing test to determine whether it is or not. I mean,
Exactly.
and that stuff dates back only 80 years. I mean, the stories are, at the end of World War II, my thesis advisor in graduate school was in the U.S. Department of Defense, and he was one of the people that was approached by UNIVAC asking where they had a market for computers. And people were guessing that the worldwide market for computers was in the thousands at most. And of course today it's in the billions. Who God knows what it is. It's so many more. But the Internet of Things is what everybody is talking about as the next great innovation. I mean, GE announced that they were going to change the business model for aircraft engines, and they're going to be free. Because using technology, they believe they can cut the cost of maintenance so much that they can afford to give you the engine and just make money off of the maintenance. So here is an industry that you wouldn't think of at all as a computer industry that is going to be totally revolutionized over the next 3 years by the introduction of tens or hundreds of computers into the engine, so that when the plane lands, they know immediately what needs to be repaired, why, when. And they can change the entire business model of that industry, which is a huge industry.